This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, we're actually concluding our series on hope and the theology of the cross in the book of Jeremiah by focusing on our upcoming service, Blue Christmas. The Blue Christmas service is a relatively recent service in the history of the church, and it is always as close as we're able to get it to the longest night of the year, the shortest day of the year. And so it's called a service of reflection for the longest night. And it's made specifically for those for whom Christmas is a very difficult time. And so I'd like to reflect on what this service is and what it's doing, what its themes are, because it is a fitting conclusion to the question of hope held in tension with the reality of grief, which, as we discussed in our last video, can be held together in the theology of the cross. Because in the cross is where Martin Luther says God's character of one of love and mercy shines forward. And in that, we have the character of love and mercy shining forward, but within it is the very contradiction that it is the cross. It also invites forward the human condition and the rejection of God and God's solution to that rejection. The pain that we live in the world, the grief we hold from the loss of that world, and the hope because of what God does. So I'd like to suggest that this theology of the cross fits and holds hope and grief together, exemplified in this Blue Christmas service. So I'd like to go over a few of the themes of this Blue Christmas service. So when you open into this service that will happen on Tuesday, it begins with the familiar hymn, O come, Emmanuel. Which, of course, we sing it so frequently, I think sometimes we forget the words, but it is an appeal to God to do something. Ransom captive Israel. Come here, Emmanuel. We're mourning in exile here. And then that appeal leads to the action rejoice. That in the very appeal to God is the belief God's going to do something about it. Then we have our first reading, which is from Isaiah chapter 40. And this second part of Isaiah, beginning in chapter 40, which we call second Isaiah, is framing suffering and grief differently than it was before. See, before this, in Israel, they often thought of suffering as a result of the judgment of God. Well, in Isaiah 40, it suggests that is simply not true. That suffering is not a reflection of judgment, that there is, in fact, a completely new thing going on, and that suffering and darkness is not necessarily because God is punishing you in some way. Maybe obvious to us, but not obvious to the audience of this book of Isaiah. And I think we slide into that so frequently. And then that leads to the famous Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And in that call to God of asking why, it is also an appeal to God to be with us. It's recalling that God, you have been there for our ancestors. And so the appeal is, maybe I can't boldly enough say, I know you're going to be here, God. but I can recognize you have been in the past. This leads us into, in Blue Christmas, the center of the service, which is a liturgy of remembrance, where we're invited to go through a journey on this liturgy of remembrance. We begin where we're invited to simply pause and remember what we've lost. People we've lost, things we've lost. Where is our grief sitting? We can only see that if we pause. Then we're invited to remember that very grief. Where are those places where that grief is alive in us? What is it we've lost? What is present for us this day? Then we remember ourselves, recognizing that grief is caused by events external to us, but the grief and emotions we feel associated with grief are things that exist in ourselves. As all the different ways grief shows up, those are things that are who we are. And as we remember ourselves, we also remember our mortality. Part of what we grieve is not just those other people that have lost, but for our own self, recognizing we too are human and we too will die. And this leads us to remember our faith, but not faith vaguely. Faith that is there in the Christmas story. This is a radical turn. You might have thought that this was going to be about we pause, we grieve, remember who we are, and then we see how God uplifts us. Instead, we tell the Christmas story. And there's something going on because the story of Christmas in Luke, which we read, is a narrative. And a narrative is different than simply a truth I'm going to tell you. It is true, but it's not a proposition. It is something that has a past, it has a present, it has a future. There's a story where we lead with Jesus from this whole drama, going to Nazareth, finding this place to stay, giving birth in this manger. That can be a message for us that yes, there's a past. Yes, we've lost. Yes, there's a present. Yes, we have grief. Yes, it lives in ourselves. And there's a future which includes mortality, but it also includes resurrection. And here we have hope. We don't dismiss or deny the very grief and the very self, but the hope is that there is something more. Not just something bigger in the cosmos, but something more even for yourself. There is a past, there is a present, there is a future. And so there we have a sense of light in the darkness, leading that journey. There is hope that lives in and allows for grief as well. This is the kind of hope that the theology of the cross, that shows the love and mercy of God in the midst of darkness and pain, without denying the darkness and pain. That's the kind of hope that we'll be expressing in our Blue Christmas service. This has been Theology Bits with Pastor Ben.